Roy Canfield had spent 34 years as an extension agent for Doddridge County, West Virginia, which meant he had seen most things a piece of farmland could do to a man, and most things a man could do to a piece of farmland. He was 68 years old in the fall of 2011, 2 years retired, and he had no particular reason to be standing at the fence line of Gerald Pritchard's property on a Thursday morning in October, except that he was driving past on Barnett Run Road, and something in the picture had not been right. There was a flatbed from Sycamore Hill Vineyards parked at the gate. There were wooden pallets on the ground. And there was Gerald Pritchard, a man Roy had known for 11 years, standing at the edge of those pallets with his hands in his jacket pockets, not unloading anything, not calling anyone to help, just looking at what had arrived the way a man looks at something he has been waiting on for a long time and is not quite ready to start. Roy had watched farmers look at equipment that way. He had watched them look at sick livestock that way. He had never seen Gerald look at anything that way. He drove past, turned around at the next wide spot in the road, drove back and pulled in at the gate. He told me this in his kitchen in West Union on a rainy afternoon in March of 2024, with a cup of coffee going cold in front of him, and he said he still could not say with any certainty why he had stopped. He had not had a reason. He just felt like he ought to. This is the kind of story my father would have told at the supper table. If yours would have told it too, this channel is for you. Subscribe, and we will keep telling them. The grapes that came off that flatbed on the third Thursday of October 2011 had originated at Sycamore Hill Vineyards, a 22-acre operation in Pleasants County, West Virginia, about 40 miles west of Gerald's farm. A man named Dennis Orr had been growing Norton and Vidal Blanc there for 9 years, selling clean fruit at contract price to a winery distributor out of Parkersburg. That year, a stretch of warm, wet weather through late August and into the first week of September had moved Botrytis cinerea through a significant portion of his Norton block. The gray surface mold had spread through the clusters, softening the skins, splitting the berries, concentrating the juice inside in ways that made the grapes useless to a winery making commercial table wine. Not useless to everything, just useless to Dennis Orr. He had called 4 farms before he called Gerald. 2 had used the grapes for compost. 1 had not answered. 1 had said no before he got through the description. Gerald said yes while Dennis was still talking, which Dennis found either encouraging or unsettling. He told Roy Canfield later that he had not been able to decide which, and had not fully decided by the time I talked to him either. A neighbor named Carol Spears, who ran a hay operation on the next ridge over and had known Gerald since they were in school together, drove past the gate on Barnett Run Road around 8 in the morning and saw the flatbed and the pallets and Gerald standing there looking at them. Carol pulled over and hollered from the road to ask if Gerald needed help getting rid of something. Gerald said no, he was keeping it. Carol looked at the pallets for a moment and said it looked like the kind of thing a man got rid of, not kept. Gerald said he supposed it did. Carol pulled back out onto the road and drove on, and he told me when I reached him by phone 2 years later that he had thought about that morning more than once after the magazine piece came out. He said he had been standing about 30 feet from 12 years of careful work and had not seen it at all. That is not a criticism of Carol Spears. He was doing what a reasonable man does. Dennis Orr was not being careless when he dumped those grapes. He was doing the reasonable thing with something that had failed his quality standard. The same thing any processor does with material outside his usable range. He had no obligation to understand what Gerald intended. Most men in the county would not have understood it either. Gerald Pritchard was not, by any outward sign, a man who made artisan food products. He ran 86 acres in Doddridge County, about 60 in hay. the rest in a cow-calf operation, with a mixed herd of Black Angus crosses and a few Simmental that he had worked with since 2004. He had a John Deere 6130R he had bought used in Clarksburg in 2009, 1,400 hours on the clock, for $48,200. He had a pond that frosted reliably by the first week of December. He sold calves in the fall. He sold hay in the summer. That was the operation. He had no press, no barrels, no fermentation vessel of any kind. He had, however, grown up listening to his father. Roy Canfield walked to where Gerald was standing at the pallets. Gerald nodded at him. Roy looked at the Norton grapes on those pallets and saw what any experienced agricultural man would have seen. Botrytis bunch rot, well past the threshold where a winemaker has any use for a cluster. The skins were soft and collapsed, the mold gray and visible, the whole mass of it giving off a smell that was sweet and sharp at the same time, like fruit that had gone past ripeness into something else. In a different context, a man might call it ruin. Roy had seen a lot of ruin in 34 years of extension work. He knew what it looked like. He asked Gerald what he planned to do with them. Gerald said he was going to make balsamic. Roy said he did not know Gerald made balsamic. Gerald said he did not. Yet, Roy looked at the grapes for another moment. He did not laugh. He was not a man who laughed at farmers. He said that seemed like a fair answer, and asked if Gerald wanted a hand unloading. Gerald said yes, and that was how Roy Canfield ended up spending the better part of a Thursday morning in October, moving pallets of damaged grapes into a barn in Doddridge County, without any clear understanding of what he was helping build. Wendell Pritchard had farmed 83 acres in the same county from 1969 until his death in January of 2006. He was 71 years old. He had never been a complicated man. He kept his equipment clean, his fence lines tight, and his expenses in a red ledger from the hardware store in Harrisville. Same style every year, different year. He grew hay, ran cattle, and in his later years kept a small garden of heirloom tomatoes that he had grown from the same seed stock for 16 consecutive seasons. He had two ways of learning things. He watched what other farmers did, and he read. He read the extension bulletins that came in the mail, and he ordered books on subjects that had caught his attention: soil biology, small batch fermentation, the history of traditional foods. He had no formal education past high school, and he did not think that was a problem. He thought the problem, if there was one, was not reading enough. In 1987, he ordered a food history book from a used bookstore in Pittsburgh for $6 plus postage. It had a chapter on the traditional food products of Emilia-Romagna in northern Italy, and that chapter had 3 pages on Aceto Balsamico Tradizionale. He read those 3 pages several times. He talked about what was in them, over the years, with no particular urgency, the way a man mentions something he finds genuinely interesting, without expecting anyone to act on it. He explained it to Gerald in pieces, when Gerald was young enough to sit still for it, and Gerald had listened the way sons listen, when they have not yet learned what to hold on to. Traditional balsamic vinegar, the real thing, not the grocery store product, which is wine vinegar with caramel coloring and which has about as much in common with the authentic article as a can of beef broth has with a 12-hour stock. The genuine product starts with grape must, pressed juice from very ripe or botrytized fruit, cooked over low heat to roughly 30% of its original volume. That cooked must is most occato. It goes into a wooden barrel to begin aging, oak first, then chestnut, then cherry, then mulberry, moving in measured amounts from each barrel to the next smaller one each year as the liquid concentrates and the wood shapes it. After 12 years, what has survived this progression is called young traditional balsamic. After 25, it is extra vecchio, extra old. The bottles are small, the prices are not. Wendell had wanted to make it. He had not had the grapes come right at the right time, and then his joints had slowed him down, and then the January of 2006 had settled the question for good. Gerald had thought about that in the years since. Not with bitterness, more with the steady awareness that some things a man sets down have to be picked up by someone else, or they do not get picked up at all. He had been watching for the right grapes for 5 years before Dennis Orr called. Roy Canfield stayed for 2 hours that first Thursday morning. He helped Gerald move the pallets to the barn wall and watched him sort through the clusters, pulling out the ones that had collapsed fully, setting aside the ones where the botrytis had gone deep, but not all the way, making a third pile of the Norton clusters that had surface mold only and were otherwise structurally intact. Gerald worked through the pallets slowly, handling each cluster without rushing, the way a man handles something he intends to use rather than something he intends to discard. He did not explain what he was doing while he did it. Roy did not ask. When they were done sorting, Gerald said he thought he had about 900 pounds of workable fruit, maybe a little more. Roy looked at the pile and said that seemed about right. Gerald wrote the number in his ledger, 910 LB estimated. Norton, botrytized, Pleasants County WV origin, and Roy drove home. The must reduction took 4 mornings. Gerald pressed the Norton grapes with a hand-crank basket press he borrowed from a homesteader outside of Salem, who used it for hard cider every fall. A heavy steel and oak frame the man had bought at an auction in 1998 and had been using since without complaint. Gerald pressed in 2 batches, then moved the juice into a 30-quart stock pot on a propane burner set up inside the barn door, with the big door propped open for the steam. He ran it slow, the way his father had described, never letting it boil, stirring with a white oak paddle he had shaped himself from a piece of timber he had cut and dried in 2008 for a different purpose that had never fully materialized. He watched the surface and wrote down his temperatures in the red ledger, right-hand page, same page where Wendell had kept his notes, a habit Gerald had kept without entirely meaning to. The liquid that came out after 4 days of reduction was dark as mahogany stain and thick enough to hold a slow bead when it fell from the paddle. Mosto Cato. Cooked must. It smelled like something between molasses and dried cherry, and something he did not have a word for yet. He set it aside and went to find barrels. He was not going to spend $800 on new cooperage for something he had not yet proved. He spent the month of November driving to estate sales and farm auctions across 4 counties. In Wirt County, he found a 20-liter bourbon oak barrel at an estate sale for $55. The deceased had used it as a planter on the porch, which had left the outside weathered but the inside intact. In Preston County, a classified listing led him to a man giving up on apple brandy who had a chestnut barrel he wanted gone, 15 liters, $40, and Gerald drove 2.5 hours each way to get it. The cherry barrel he found at a cooperage in Elkins clearing end-of-season stock, 12 liters, $38. The mulberry barrel came last, at a farm auction in Calhoun County in January of 2012, where a man's family was selling off 40 years of accumulated equipment, and no one in the room had any use for a small barrel made of unusual wood. 8 liters. Mulberry, Gerald paid $27. He drove home through a light sleet on Route 16 with the mulberry barrel wrapped in a horse blanket in the bed of his F-250 and did not feel like he had overpaid. He had spent $160 on barrels. The grapes had cost him nothing. He figured if the whole business came to nothing, he was out $160 in 5 months of mornings, which was not a disaster by any measure he used for disasters. The must went into the oak barrel on the second Saturday of January 2012. He wrote the date on a strip of masking tape and pressed it to the stave above the bung. He wrote the same date in the red ledger on the right-hand page, below the temperature notes from the reduction, and drew a single line under it the way his father used to draw a line under a completed entry to show the matter was started and not yet done. Roy Canfield came back to the barn 3 times in the first 2 years. He did not have technical knowledge of what was happening in those barrels. Nobody in the Doddridge County Extension Office had ever covered traditional Italian fermented products in any curriculum Roy had encountered. But he was curious in the way that men are curious when they have spent their careers watching agricultural processes and encounter one they have not seen. He would lean over the barrel, smell the bung, ask Gerald how it was going. Gerald would say he could not tell yet. Roy would nod. They would go inside and have coffee. Roy was there the morning of the 2nd annual transfer, moving a measured quantity from the oak to the chestnut, from the chestnut to the cherry, topping the oak from a small reserve of the original cooked must that Gerald had put up in mason jars and kept on a shelf above the barrels. He watched Gerald work through the process the way you watch a man do something he has thought through carefully enough that there is no wasted motion. Not quick, not slow, just exactly the speed the job wanted. The first Pritchard Farm Balsamic was bottled on a Saturday morning in late March of 2024. 12 years and 2 months after the must went into oak, which cleared the minimum aging threshold for traditional method product by a small margin Gerald had been patient enough to wait for. He had 187 bottles, 100 milliliters each. Amber glass he had ordered from a restaurant supply warehouse in Morgantown, $94 for the case. He sealed them with a short cork and a wax dip done one at a time over a camping stove on the workbench, turning each bottle slowly in the melted wax, the way a man waxes a thread. Steady, no hurrying it. Roy Canfield was there that morning. He did not help with the waxing. Gerald had a system for it, and Roy knew better than to interrupt a system. But he was there, sitting on a stool near the door with his coffee, watching the way he had been watching for 12 years. Gerald priced each bottle at $38. He sold them through a table at the Doddridge County Farm Bureau Market, through calls that Roy made to people he knew, who knew people who cared about that kind of thing, and through 3 specialty grocery stores in Morgantown and Charleston, whose buyers a food writer from a regional magazine had contacted after making the drive out to the farm in early April. He sold all 187 bottles in 19 days. 19 days at $38 apiece comes out to $706 in gross sales, from grapes that cost him nothing and barrels that cost him $160 and 12 years of Saturday mornings checking on things that were not ready yet. He is 57 now. He still runs the hay and the cow-calf herd, the Angus crosses, the same Simmental bloodlines he has worked since 2004. The Balsamic battery on the south wall of the barn now holds 7 barrels, 2 separate vintages in progress. He brought in a second oak barrel to handle the volume from the 2022 season. He still keeps the red ledger, same style his father used, still writes expenses on the left page and notes on the right. The entry from January 2012 is still there, with a single line drawn under it in his father's style, the masking tape date long since curled off the stave and stored in an envelope inside the front cover. Dennis Orr called in the spring of 2025 after reading about the bottling. He said he had not thought much about where those grapes ended up in 2011, and that he was glad they had not just gone into the ground. Gerald said he was glad too. Dennis asked about a standing arrangement for the reject Norton each year at a negotiated price per pound. Gerald said he needed to think about it. He called back 6 days later and said yes, but with a condition: the botrytis percentage had to be above 30. Not surface mold only, actual penetration into the clusters, the way it had been in 2011, the way that changes the sugar and the acid and the way the must behaves. If the season came in clean, he did not want them. Dennis said he would try, Gerald said trying and guaranteeing were not the same thing. There was a pause. Dennis said he understood that. Roy Canfield was in the barn in June of 2024 when Gerald pulled the cork on the chestnut barrel, second in the sequence, then in its 13th year, and held it under Roy's nose. Roy stood there a good while. He was not the kind of man who worked hard to say things he did not mean, and he told me that he had stood there trying to find a word for what he was smelling and had not found one. He said it smelled like something old had learned to be patient. He said he could not improve on that description and did not try. He said Wendell Pritchard would have known exactly what to do with a small glass of it. Gerald said that was the whole idea. That it had always been the whole idea. There is a kind of knowledge that does not come with a degree or a certificate or a man in a white coat explaining it to you. It comes at a kitchen table, or on a back porch, or standing in a barn in the October cold, while a father talks about something he read in a book that cost him $6. It comes in pieces, unhurried, without any promise that it will ever be used. It waits in the memory the way a barrel waits in a barn, patient, quiet, doing its slow work in the dark. Wendell Pritchard never made his balsamic. The years and the joints and the January cold took care of that. But the knowledge did not go with him. It went to the barn wall in Doddridge County, and it waited there in 7 barrels for anyone willing to check on it every spring and write down what they found. Some things are built by the person who finishes them. Some things are built by the person who started them, years before the starting. Wendell built this one.